I will do a brief intro. So she's a paper and book conservator collaborating with Conservation for Digitisation on two projects at the British Library. So one is the International Dunhuang Project, and the Qatar Foundation Partnership is the other one. So she received an MA in Conservation at Camberwell College of Arts in 2016, thanks to the National Council of Science and Technology Scholarship and the Jumex Foundation Scholarship from Mexico. So she holds a BA in Science in Conservation of Cultural Heritage that she completed in 2010 from the National School of Conservation, Restoration and Museography, Manuel Castillo Negrete. So she's worked for institutions in Mexico, the UK, Japan and Spain, including the National Agency for Cultural Heritage Conservation, of the National Institute of Anthropology and History, the V&A, Special Collections in the Science Library at UCL, the Dr. Williams Library, the National Library of Spain, Tokyo National Research Institute for Cultural Properties, and the Blue House, with Frida Kahlo Museum. So together with Patricia de la Garza, she's been awarded a mention of honor in the Paul Corrimans Award for a bachelor degree thesis, conservation proposal for the 1715 choir book based on the study of the structural elements and the binding of the choir books copied by Friar Miguel de Aguilar in the 18th century. Right, now with no further ado, I leave the floor to them.
So welcome to our second presentation. This time we're going to focus on the different types of conservation treatments that we have carried out over the past 5 years. We're going to be showing lots of visual examples with many pictures and some videos, so I hope you enjoy. Firstly, how do various treatment categories fit into our workflow? Through refining and developing the guidelines for the working processes over the course of the project, we have identified some categories into which our conservation treatment approaches can be classified. The first one is saving time. The second is compromising and having a minimal intervention approach. The third is taking time, where we carry out more extensive treatment. And lastly, doing nothing. Each section will be further elaborated in this presentation. Before we get to that, I wanted to quickly mention risk assessment, which is very relevant to how and why we're able to fit these treatments into various categories. As conservators, every treatment that we carry out involves some sort of risk assessment. We constantly weigh out the pros and cons of carrying out or not carrying out certain treatments and whether the outcome will be worth this, both for the item and the context of a project. Through the extensive experience we gained in treating literally hundreds of East Asian scrolls, risk assessment became an internalized part of our everyday working processes, something that we would determine ourselves in our heads, as well as through discussion with colleagues. In order to have a written record for the types of decisions that we would make, we did compile a risk assessment spreadsheet specifically for this project. Carrying out risk assessments, although it sounds quite boring, is actually a very important part of our everyday work because it helps us to make the right decision when treating items and it guides our working processes.
So first up is saving time. And this is the category where we can be very minimal in our treatments and therefore save a lot of time. And if I may add so myself, this category provided us with a lot of instant gratification, which in such a laborious project was actually very welcome. So in this category, we have two types of material. Short scroll fragments, usually under 80 centimeters in length, which can be encapsulated in melanic sleeves, and therefore can be treated in a very, very minimal way. And then we have good condition scrolls that have very little damage and usually under 5 hours of treatment time is enough to make them stable and fit for digitization. So in this category, the manuscripts usually require little to no infills and minimal tear repair, and these can be done very selectively. The paper is usually stable and we would describe their overall condition as good. they require no or a very small amount of flattening to make the text legible. And in this category, one of our most efficient tools is humidification. It flattens the manuscripts, returns some flexibility, and makes the text more legible. So here you have two examples, which are very satisfying because you can see a very clear difference before and after. But actually these treatments, the top one, I believe, was around 3 hours. The one in the bottom, probably an hour and a half. So these show how big of a difference humidification and a little bit of tear repair can make. With the top one, if this was a longer scroll, we would have to infill these losses to make it stable, but because it was put in a Melanic sleeve, that was not necessary. So here you can see how the encapsulation in Melanics is done. We use spot welder to keep the scrolls in place, and then another welding machine to seal the edges so that the no dust or dirt is getting inside the sleeve and the scroll won't fall out. We also weld little labels that help to identify the scrolls, and then they go back to storage and they're placed in their designated folders.
So the next category is compromising and minimal intervention. This makes up the bulk of the conservation treatments in the Lotus Sutra Project. Only the operations that are necessary to ensure safe handling and digitization are carried out. These include humidification and flattening of selected panels, surface cleaning, removing the accretions that obscure the text, repairing only large tears that are at immediate risk or further damage, infilling only large losses that pose threat to the scroll's stability, and leaving historical repairs untouched if they cause only minor distortions and don't affect the legibility of the text. Smaller tears and losses, which are at low risk of further deterioration, are left untreated. We also use pre-dyed Japanese paper for the repairs. Here is an example of minimal intervention treatment. As you can see, the before and after pictures of the first panel, the scroll has been surface cleaned to remove any accretions and dirt. Soiling that isn't disruptive to the text and that it's not in an area requiring treatment may be left in place. Here, the first has been humidified and flattened, and we only humidify and flatten only selected panels, which require it in order to make text more legible, repair tears, or infill losses. Lightly crumpled panels, which are otherwise in good condition, are not routinely flattened solely for aesthetic purposes. Repairs are only carried out in large tears which are at a risk of further damage. Small tearing along the edges, which is usually at low risk of further deterioration when the scrolls are handled and stored properly, can be left untreated, especially on scrolls made from thick fibrous paper such as this one. The historical repair on the verso has been left untouched, as it causes no minor distortions to the scroll and doesn't affect the legibility of the text. In instances where some text is presented underneath the historical repairs, we may use multispectral imaging to reveal it, rather than mechanical removing and reattach the repair after the image is captured. This is a before and after picture of a scroll in good condition, needing a tear repair and infill of the loss at the beginning. In our minimal treatment approach, we tend to only infill large losses which pose a threat to the scroll's stability. Small losses, which are at low risk, are usually left untreated. If there are any tears or crumbly bits, they may be secured with Japanese paper. While we try to match our infills in thickness, texture, and color as closely to the original as possible, we may accept that sometimes compromises must be made. For example, it may be impossible to find a perfect color match for a particular scroll among the dyed Japanese koso paper we prepared in advance. But there is no time to dye them individually for each object or to retouch the infills by hand. Whenever possible, we also stick to single layer infills instead of double layer infills, which allows shortening the drying time.
Now taking time, so extensive treatment, the elephant in the room, the category that probably caused our project manager Tan a lot of sleepless nights. While in our practice we adhere to the principle of minimal intervention, it is a common misconception that minimal treatment equals a quick one. In some cases, in case of some treatments, there is no room for compromise. Scrolls in this category are usually ones with long treatment estimates, so the 20 and 25 plus, extensive damage and complex conservation issues. Inaction would not only result in rapid further deterioration of the item's condition, but also its inability to undergo digitization, even if assisted by a conservator. Examples in this category include heavily soiled items where the text is illegible or further treatment cannot be carried out without cleaning. Extremely fragmented scrolls with extensive tear, losses, and severe distortions. Historical repairs that obscure the text and cause severe damage and distortions to the original. Presence of mold, which poses a serious health and safety hazard. And very brittle scrolls with extensive burn and oil damage. On some occasions, the items require us to seek advice and collaborate with specialists from other conservation fields, such as textile and organics conservators, to deliver comprehensive treatments to objects with damaged original rollers or silk ribbons still in place. Heavily soiled items are those where the soiling, such as mud, accretions, or excrement, obscure the text. And here's an example of a scroll heavily affected by a thick layer of crusty insect excrements. Not very pleasant to work on, I assure you. In cases like this, the removal is often necessary, not only to improve legibility, but also to enable further treatment to be carried out, as these accretions often cause stiffness to the paper and affect how our repairs adhere to the surface. Moreover, if the humidity goes up or some moisture is introduced, these dry accretions can also soften up and smear all over the surface, or cause rolled panels to stick together, potentially creating even more damage. In cases like this, we use a curdling hydrogel that we use as a damp eraser on the surface to swell these accretions, and then we remove them mechanically with a spatula or a scalpel. The fact that the gel, the curdling gel, is highly moisture retentive allows to carry the operations out without swelling and damaging the original paper substrate. Then we have extremely fragmented scrolls that have extensive tears, losses, and severe distortions. And on the screen you can see before and after pictures of the S3131, which will come back later. It was our final scroll in the project, which due to extensive mold damage was extremely fragile and quite literally was like a puzzle with a lot of detached loose bits that had to be reattached, unfolded. And in those cases, time and care must be taken to painstakingly unfold any crumpled bits of the paper and carry out all the necessary local repairs, of which there are hundreds, as the scrolls are never lined in order not to obscure the information on the verso. We also have examples of severely distorted scrolls, such as this one, which, because of the severe water damage it sustained, this panel that you can see in the picture was, the water caused the ink to run and very severe crumpling of the paper. So it was not only illegible, but also at risk of separation and further damage. So in this case, careful humidification and flattening was necessary to unfold these severely crumpled areas. The rest of the scroll survived in an excellent condition, which was quite puzzling given the extent of damage on this particular panel, and largely retained its original bright yellow dye, the huangpo, which was commonly applied to manuscript, as we mentioned, for its antifungal and insect repellent properties. And it's actually quite mysterious, quite puzzling to see both of these in this panel, as huangpo is very sensitive and usually unstable in presence of excess moisture and water. Finally, we have examples of historical repairs that either obscured the text or caused severe damage and distortions to the original scroll. In this example, a historical repair on the back was applied over a torn area without flattening and realigning the text first. Well, it kept the scroll together and prevented dissociation and it falling apart completely. It made it very difficult to make a conservation intervention and repair this area without removing the repair first. In cases like this, in order to carry out the repairs needed to stabilize the item, it might be necessary to partially or fully lift the patch off the surface. We subsequently reattached them using a system of Japanese paper tabs that Maria will show you in a few slides to minimize the tension caused to the paper support. And since the adhesion between the repair and the scroll can sometimes be stronger than that between the fibers of the paper of the scroll itself, this process has to be carried out very carefully and very slowly to avoid skinning the surface.
So this is another example, quite an extreme one, of historical repair causing very extensive damage. This scroll was made of very brittle and delicate paper, and the distortion that you can see here is due to it having been repaired on the verso with a very strong repair and uneven paste. So this is the verso of the scroll just shown in the previous slide. You can really see how large the repair is, how thick the paper is, and in some areas it is actually more than one layer, making it extremely thick. And as it's been pasted all over, you can understand how these distortions and damages were caused by the repair. On the right is after the repair was removed, excess adhesive scraped away gently and then reattached with Japanese paper tabs. In the next slide, I have a couple of videos of this Japanese paper tabs technique that we keep talking about. Both of the videos play at the same time. So on the left is the first video where I'm applying the Japanese paper tabs with small Japanese paper and applying a little bit of wheat starch paste, creating V hinges, and making sure it's not too near from the edge so that when it is reattached, the tabs don't peek out. Once the paper tabs are fully dried, and have all been applied, they are then reattached onto the scroll, which is the video on the right. Reattachment is carried out as a last step after the repairs to that area are completed. It goes without saying, but the historical repair must be placed back as close to its original position as possible. To reattach the historical repair, a small amount of wheat starch paste is applied to each paper tab. Reattachment is completed whilst the scroll is rolled, as the scroll spends the majority of its life rolled up. The larger the repair, the more crucial to reattach the historical repair in its rolled state, because if it was applied whilst it was flat, when we would then go to roll it, it would create another set of tensions. So another set of extensive damage that we have to take a lot of time treating is mold damage on scrolls. Even if inactive, mold spores are easily transmitted, therefore can pose a serious health and safety hazard to people handling them without proper PPE, or contaminate other collection items they come in contact with. Without any exceptions, once the presence of mould is identified, the object must undergo full mould remediation in the quarantine room. And this can't be carried out in any room such as our conservation studio, again for health and safety purposes. Luckily, we have a dedicated space here at the BLCC where mould remediation is carried out. This is called the quarantine room. It's an enclosed space with specialised equipment only accessible by trained staff. So this was a video of me mould cleaning. You can see how I'm wearing all the appropriate PPE. And this is done over what we call a Basser workstation, which is an air extraction fan, which pulls the air downward through suction. So with it goes all the mould spores that I am brushing away. This is a before and after photograph of a scroll with stains and mould from water damage. The tears and losses have been consolidated with Japanese paper repairs and infills. The black powdery deposit, which you can see in the before picture, is a mould, and in the after picture it has been removed, meaning it could be safely imaged and handled. However, you might notice there is still some staining left behind. In a lot of cases with mould staining, this will never 100% go away, as the mould damage does tend to leave its mark. And this is our last example of more extensive damage requiring longer treatment times. So this is brittle paper caused by oil staining. And this is an example where you can see on the bottom of the scroll there is extensive oil staining. Due to the nature of the damage, this has made the original paper very crisp, weak, and prone to snapping. This is not ideal, as it makes the item impossible to be handled, rehoused, or imaged. Treatment in this situation is absolutely crucial, as every single tear, loss, and crack must be secured with Japanese paper repairs and wheat starch paste to prevent any further crumbling and flaking and loss of fragments.
Doing nothing is the last category, and also a conservation decision that can be taken. This can sometimes be the best decision for the item or the best decision within the context of the project. In what cases do we take this decision? Within the context of a digitization project, certain treatments are simply not viable, especially if the item is stable enough to undergo imaging. There are other instances where this decision may be taken, where treatment is simply too risky, and attempting to carry out any conservation treatment would mean that the item would be compromised. If the item can undergo imaging, whether alone or assisted, and the text is legible, then this can be at times the best decision. The only time spent would be on rehousing. I will expand on these instances in the next slides. One of the most frequent examples we have of doing nothing are these previous conserved scrolls. The Lotus Sutra Project has around 100 scrolls that had been treated previously. We are able to spot these very easily. They typically are either fully or partially lined with a thick graph paper, and sometimes gauze has also been applied. There are two examples, the S2095 and the S1655. Luckily, these examples have cutouts in the linings in order to retain the textual information on the verso. However, we have also seen examples of important historical information, such as the pre-11th century historical repairs being covered by these graph paper linings. What you can also see on the verso are numerous sharp vertical creases that this very stiff lining has caused over time. On the S1655, gauze has also been added to the verso where there is text. These are, in fact, fairly stable and legible, and following the conservation assessment, were deemed suitable to go straight to digitization. However, we have no records of these treatments, Clues point to these types of treatments being carried out during the 1960s before the British Library was established. Of course, from a modern conservation perspective, these treatments are less than ideal, and certainly something we would not do today. However, we have to understand that whoever treated this at the time probably thought they were doing what was best for the item. Therefore, we cannot project too much judgment on these conservation decisions of the past. In an ideal scenario, the thick paper linings and gauze would be removed with great care and local repairs carried out instead. However, this was simply not feasible within the scope of the Lotus Sutra Project. Removing the linings for all these scrolls would not only involve a lot of risk, but also hundreds of hours of work. This would be suitable for a different type of project altogether. Here's another example of the last category, where we do nothing. Occasionally, carrying out conservation treatment for an item is simply not feasible due to the risk of involved and the fact that the treatment would be detrimental. In this case, nothing is done except rehousing. The item is digitized with assisted handling, and its access becomes restricted to the readers. As conservators working in a library, this is not a light decision to make, and only done so after extensive communication between the conservators and the curator. Throughout the project, this decision was only applied to one item. The S200 scroll, measuring 9 meters, is delaminating throughout its entire length. Delamination is when the layer of paper starts to separate. This was evident as bubbles that could be seen where the layers were coming apart. In this instance, local repairs would not make sense and would have increased the problems over the time. This is a situation where we have to accept our limitations and acknowledge that sometimes nothing can be done.
We're being signaled that this is our cue to wrap up our presentation, but we wanted to share with you this very proud moment when we digitized the final scroll on the project on the 2nd of December, which was the Moldy Puzzle S3131, which took approximately, this is probably still underestimated, some 125 hours to complete. And I just wanted, as an end note, to emphasize that this wouldn't have been possible without a fantastic team of focused and knowledgeable professionals. And we just want to take this moment to, again, acknowledge Marie Kaladgew and her input on the project. Sadly, she's not here today with us, but she'll be joining us in a moment for the Q&A. Thank you so much.